The cigarette smoke curled lazily through the October morning air as the man in the Italian suit adjusted his al-Najjar newspaper for the third time in 20 minutes. From his table at the sidewalk cafe on Rue Hamra, he possessed an unobstructed view of the apartment building across the street, a modern, cream-colored structure that housed some of Beirut's most prosperous residents. Around him, the city hummed with its particular rhythm, Mercedes taxis honking past American sedans, Radio Lebanon's morning music drifting from shop doorways, and the animated Arabic conversations of businessmen heading to their offices in the financial district. To the Lebanese businessmen hurrying past, to the shopkeepers arranging their displays beneath faded posters of President Franhay, he appeared unremarkable, another well-dressed professional enjoying his coffee and scanning headlines about Nixon's re-election campaign. They could not know that behind his dark sunglasses, trained eyes were mapping every entrance, timing every routine, cataloging every face for transmission to a nondescript building in Tel Aviv. Caesarea's watchers had been in position for 6 weeks. The newspaper bore the date October 15, 1972. Buried on page 3, a brief item noted that Munich police were still pursuing leads in their investigation of the Olympic massacre. 11 Israeli athletes dead. The world had watched in horror as hooded terrorists turned the games of peace into a theater of murder. But what the world had not seen, what it could never see, was the methodical response now unfolding in the cafes and tree-lined streets of Beirut. Abu Youssef emerged from the building at precisely 8:47 a.m., pausing to exchange pleasantries with the doorman as he had every morning for the past 3 weeks. Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar moved with the confident stride of a man who believed himself beyond reach. As a senior PLO official and one of Fatah's most effective organizers, he had orchestrated operations across the Middle East from his comfortable exile in Lebanon's cosmopolitan capital. He favored the corner table at Café de la Paix for his afternoon meetings, a habit that would prove fatally convenient for snipers positioning themselves in the building opposite. The watcher made no notes, betrayed no interest. Such details were committed to memory according to Caesarea's strict protocols, to be transcribed later in the safety of a safe house near the airport. Every pattern mattered. Every deviation could spell the difference between mission success and catastrophe when the Cadone teams finally moved. Elsewhere in the overlapping surveillance grid, another set of eyes tracked a different target. 3 blocks toward the Mediterranean, Kamal Adwan preferred his morning constitutional to the PLO offices near the Corniche. The intelligence chief's route took him past the same newsstand where Al-Anwar headlines proclaimed Arab solidarity, the same flower vendor arranging jasmine and roses, the same cluster of old men playing backgammon beneath campaign posters. Adwan invariably stopped at the second-floor balcony of his apartment building to survey the street below, a security precaution that ironically provided perfect target identification for the watchers timing his movements from a rented room across the avenue. Foreign correspondents from Time and Paris Match occasionally strolled these same streets, filing stories about the PLO's growing influence in this Paris of the Middle East. None suspected they were documenting a killing ground. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the photographs accumulated like evidence in a capital case. The faces stared back from surveillance shots filed in manila folders marked with operational code names and target priorities, Abu Youssef stepping into his cream-colored Mercedes at exactly the angle that would allow a strike team to approach unseen, Adwan lighting his morning gitan with his back to the building where death would eventually find him, Kamal Nasser adjusting his French tie before entering meetings where the next operations against Israeli civilians were planned. These were not the desperate fedayeen of refugee camps, but the architects of terror living in bourgeois comfort, coordinating murder over espresso and French pastries while their bodyguards waited outside in the deceptive safety of Lebanese sunshine. Golda Meir had been unequivocal in her instructions to Mossad chief Zvi Zamir following Munich, "Send forth the boys." The phrase carried biblical weight, an echo of King David's warriors sent to punish Israel's enemies. But these boys wore business suits and spoke perfect Arabic, carried passports from a dozen nations and moved through European capitals like deadly ghosts. The irony was not lost on the planners, Palestinian leaders who ordered the murder of athletes barely older than schoolchildren would themselves be hunted by operators young enough to be their sons. The operation taking shape bore the poetic codename Spring of Youth, a promise that before the next spring flowers bloomed in Verdun's manicured gardens, youth would be paid back in kind. The men walking Beirut's comfortable streets had stolen the future from 11 young Israelis. Now their own futures were being measured in weeks, not years. By November, surveillance had transformed into surgical preparation. The watchers had compiled dossiers thick enough to reconstruct their targets' entire lives. They knew which cafe table Adwan preferred because its view allowed him to monitor the street, ironically the same visibility that would one day betray him to approaching assassins. They knew Abu Youssef kept a loaded Beretta in his bedside drawer but left it there during his morning routine. They knew Nasser's wife served dinner at precisely 8 o'clock, creating a window of predictable isolation. The Verdun district, with its jasmine-scented streets and expensive apartments, had become as familiar to Israeli intelligence as the suburbs of Ramat Gan. Every doorman had been catalogued, every potential witness identified, every escape route timed to the second. The watchers could navigate these streets blindfolded, slip through shadows that their targets never noticed, disappear into the urban landscape like smoke. The Palestinians, meanwhile, noticed nothing. In their Lebanese sanctuary, why should they? Beirut remained their city, its government sympathetic, its police cooperative, its cafes filled with supportive journalists and European leftists eager to hear tales of resistance. The Mediterranean breeze still carried the scent of possibility, not the metallic taste of approaching retribution. In the restaurants where they dined on French cuisine and the salons where they entertained visiting dignitaries, the conversation remained focused on future operations, on striking back at Israel, on the long war that would eventually liberate Palestine. They did not know that their voices were being recorded through directional microphones, their movements tracked by teams that rotated every 72 hours, their lives measured and weighed in rooms where men with empty eyes studied architectural plans and synchronized their watches with Tel Aviv time. The dossiers were closed. The routes were fixed. All that remained was for the clock to catch up with the crosshairs. The coffee had grown cold in Golda Meir's cup as she studied the photographs spread across the polished table in her Jerusalem office. March rain drummed against the windows, but inside the Prime Minister's residence, the only sound was the steady tick of an antique clock and the occasional rustle of papers. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, his single eye scanning intelligence reports with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime soldier, broke the silence with characteristic bluntness. "They think they're untouchable in Beirut," he said, tapping a surveillance photograph of Abu Youssef stepping from his Mercedes. "Time to correct that assumption." Meir nodded slowly. At 74, the Iron Lady of Israeli politics had seen enough war to know that some decisions could only be made in the cold arithmetic of necessity. The Munich massacre had demanded a response, 6 months of methodical preparation had provided the means. Now, in the grey light of a March morning, vengeance would receive its formal authorization. 20 minutes, she said, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment. In and out before they know what hit them. The words hung in the air like a trigger half pulled. Around the table, the planners straightened in their chairs. Surveillance reports became assault plans. The watchers would soon become killers. The unit's selection had been inevitable from the moment planning began. Lieutenant Colonel Ehud Barak, commanding officer of Sayeret Matkal, represented everything the Israeli military had learned about precision warfare in its 25 years of existence. At 31, he possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and operational ruthlessness that such missions demanded. His men joked that he could disassemble a watch blindfolded and put it back together faster than a Swiss craftsman. They did not joke about his ability to plan operations that left enemies dead and his soldiers alive. "We'll need naval support for insertion and extraction," Barak told the assembled commanders in the sterile briefing room beneath IDF headquarters. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the detailed maps of Beirut's coastline. Elite meets elite, Matkal for the kill, Shayetet for the ride, Zonanim to hold the ground. Each unit will be a cog in a machine designed to function perfectly for 20 minutes, and then vanish. The marriage reflected Israel's evolution from desperate improvisation to calculated lethality. Every commander understood his role in the larger mechanism. Every soldier would know exactly where to be, when to be there, and what to do when the shooting started. Meanwhile, in Beirut, Mossad's long preparation entered its final phase. The safe houses were in place months earlier, unremarkable flats rented by businessmen with impeccable papers and flawless Arabic. From these bases, intelligence operatives conducted the delicate work of mapping their targets' lives down to the smallest detail. They knew that Abu Yusuf's wife served tea to visitors at precisely 4 o'clock each afternoon. They knew that Kamal Adwan's bodyguard took his dinner break at 9:30. They knew that Kamal Nasser kept irregular hours but always returned home by midnight. Such intelligence required patience and proximity. Operatives posed as foreign journalists, European businessmen, even Palestinian sympathizers attending solidarity meetings in stuffy conference rooms. They memorized the creaking sounds of particular staircases, the sight lines from apartment windows, the response times of Lebanese security forces. Every detail mattered because in 20 minutes of coordinated violence, there would be no time for improvisation. The training began in earnest during the final weeks of March. In a residential district of North Tel Aviv, Israeli commandos transformed ordinary apartment buildings into laboratories of lethality. The structures, scheduled for demolition, provided perfect replicas of Beirut's modern residential architecture. Room by room, the soldiers rehearsed their approach, silent movement up staircases, coordinated door breaches, room-clearing procedures that left no corner unsearched. Barak insisted on perfection. "We get one chance," he reminded his men during endless repetitions. 20 minutes from first contact to extraction. No second takes, no do-overs. They knew their targets only from photographs and routines, but repetition blurred that distance until it felt personal. The commandos practiced until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. They knew how many steps from the lobby to the target floor. They knew which doors opened inward and which opened out. They knew the precise angle needed to neutralize sentries without alerting the entire building. In the democracy of Israeli special forces, expertise, not rank, ruled. Every private could execute the mission as cleanly as any officer. Time compressed as April arrived with its deceptive spring warmth. Weather reports from the Lebanese coast indicated favorable conditions for amphibious operations. Intelligence updates confirmed that all three targets maintained their predictable routines. Equipment checks verified that every weapon, every communication device, every piece of specialized gear performed to specification. In his final briefing, Barak spread architectural drawings across the table with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Abu Yusuf, Apartment 3B. Adwan, Apartment 6A. Nasser, Ground Floor Rear. His finger traced the routes his teams would follow through the buildings. Insertion at 0130 hours, synchronized assault at 0145, extraction complete by 0205. The mathematics of violence had been calculated to the second. Lebanese police response, 12 minutes. PLO reinforcements, 18. Israeli teams back on the water, 20. 23 years after Israel's founding, its reach had extended to the comfortable apartments of Beirut. The men who would carry out the mission were products of a nation that had learned to strike first and ask questions later. They represented the evolutionary endpoint of Jewish military thought, no longer the victims of history, but its architects. In their hands, the ancient promise of retribution would be fulfilled with modern precision. The spring of 1973 was arriving early in Beirut, and it would blossom in gunfire. The machinery of vengeance stood silent only until the order came to let it sing. The Mediterranean stretched black and endless beyond the harbor lights of Haifa as 8 Israeli missile boats slipped their moorings in the pre-dawn darkness of April 9. No fanfare marked their departure, no crowds gathered to wish them well. The only witnesses were the night shift dockworkers who had learned long ago not to ask questions about naval movements that occurred without official schedule or announcement. Lieutenant Colonel Ehud Barak stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, watching the Israeli coastline fade into the gloom. Behind him, the boat's cargo hold contained 21 of Israel's most lethal soldiers, their weapons cleaned and checked for the third time in 6 hours. Their faces, blackened with combat paint, revealed nothing of the tension that comes before crossing from preparation into action. They had trained for this moment until every movement became instinct. Now instinct would meet reality on the streets of Beirut. 75 men were crossing the water to settle a debt written in blood. The flotilla moved in formation through the Mediterranean darkness, 8 gray shadows cutting through swells that would normally carry commercial traffic and fishing boats. But at this hour, in these waters, the Israeli force moved alone. Radio silence had been imposed from the moment they cleared the harbor, Communication would be by prearranged signals only. Lebanese coastal radar was sophisticated enough to detect large surface contacts, but not sophisticated enough to distinguish between a convoy of missile boats and the merchant vessels that regularly plied these shipping lanes. 120 miles stretched between Vengeance and its targets. In the cramped quarters below deck, the commandos settled into the peculiar rhythm of military transport. Some dozed with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers who had learned to rest whenever possible. Others checked their equipment with obsessive precision, counting ammunition, testing radio frequencies, reviewing the architectural drawings they had memorized during weeks of preparation. The Shayetet 13 naval commandos, most at home on the water, moved through the vessel with easy confidence. For the Sayeret Matkal men, the sea crossing was simply an obstacle to overcome before they could apply their particular skills on dry land. Barak moved among his men with quiet authority, offering no speeches or rallying words. Such theatrics were for conscripts and weekend warriors. These soldiers understood their mission with crystalline clarity: eliminate 3 Palestinian leaders who had orchestrated terror against Israeli civilians, then return to this same beach within the span of a single hour. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Meanwhile, in Beirut, the final pieces of intelligence fell into place. Mossad agents, some of whom had lived in Lebanese identity for months, conducted their last surveillance sweeps of the target buildings. Youssef had returned to his apartment in Verdun at his customary hour, his Mercedes parked in its usual spot beneath the building's entrance. Kamal Adwan was at home with his family, his security detail reduced to a single bodyguard who would spend the night playing cards in the building's lobby. Kamal Nasser had attended a PLO meeting until nearly midnight before returning to his ground floor flat, where lights burned behind drawn curtains. The confirmation signals went out through secure channels, all targets in place, no unexpected security complications, local police patrols following their normal patterns. The operation would proceed as planned. As the Israeli boats approached Lebanese territorial waters, engines were throttled back to minimize their acoustic signature. The final approach required delicate seamanship. Too fast, and the engine noise would alert coastal observers. Too slow, and they would miss their precisely calculated timing. The Shayetet 13 commanders had rehearsed this approach in the waters off Tel Aviv, but rehearsal never perfectly replicated the tension of actual operations. Every wave that slapped against the hull, every gull that cried in the darkness, every distant light on the Lebanese shore reminded them that discovery meant mission failure, and likely death. At 0200 hours, the flotilla reached the designated launch point 3 miles off the Beirut coast. The sea was relatively calm, with swells running at less than 2 feet, ideal conditions for small boat operations. On command, the Zodiac inflatable boats were lowered into the water with practiced efficiency. 19 black rubber craft, each carrying 3 to 4 commandos, would complete the journey to the beach under their own power. The transition from steel deck to rubber boat marked the point of no return. The commandos climbed down rope ladders with their weapons and equipment, settling into the Zodiacs with minimal conversation. Each boat carried enough firepower to level a city block, but success would depend on precision, not firepower. The urban battlefield awaiting them demanded surgical strikes, not artillery barrages. The outboard motors started with muffled growls, then settled into the quiet purr of engines designed for stealth operations. The boat commanders checked their compasses and synchronized their watches with the mother ships. At precisely 0215 hours, the first Zodiac began its run toward the Lebanese shore. 1 mile from the beach, the engines fell silent. The final approach would be made under paddle power, the rubber boats gliding through the darkness like predatory shadows. The commandos could see the lights of Beirut stretching along the coastline, a city of nearly 1 million people, most of whom slept peacefully, in their beds, unaware that death was approaching from the sea. The Corniche, Beirut's famous waterfront boulevard, lay quiet except for the occasional late-night taxi and the soft glow of streetlights reflecting on wet pavement. Palestinian leaders who had ordered the murder of Olympic athletes now lay sleeping in apartments less than 2 miles from where Israeli commandos paddled silently through the Mediterranean surf. The irony was not lost on the men in the boats. They were using the same element, surprise in darkness, that their enemies had employed in Munich. But where the Palestinians had killed innocents, the Israelis came for the guilty. On the beach, engines were already waiting. Mossad operatives who had spent months establishing their cover identities now stood beside rental cars, keys in hand, eyes scanning the dark water for the first sign of approaching boats. Everything was ready, escape routes mapped, alternate transportation arranged, emergency signals established. The ground support network that would carry the commandos from beach to target and back again represented months of meticulous preparation condensed into a few hours of flawless execution. The first Zodiac scraped against sand at exactly 0230 hours. Dark figures rolled over the sides and waded through the shallows, weapons held high above the gentle surf. Behind them, more boats appeared from the darkness, disgorging their human cargo onto Lebanese soil. The crossing was complete. Now the real work would begin. The transformation took place in the back seat of a rented Peugeot as it moved through the quiet streets of West Beirut at midnight. Lieutenant Colonel Ehud Barak, Israel's most decorated Special Forces officer, submitted with professional stoicism to an indignity that would have been unthinkable in any other context. He was being made into a woman. The Mossad operative applying the makeup worked with the practiced efficiency of a theater professional, which in a sense he was. False identities were an art form in intelligence work, and tonight's performance would be played before an audience that could not be allowed to applaud. A black wig concealed Barak's military haircut. Carefully applied cosmetics softened the angular features that had become familiar to Palestinian intelligence services. A long coat and modest dress completed the deception. "You make a very convincing Lebanese housewife," whispered the agent, stepping back to admire his work. Barak examined his reflection in a compact mirror, seeing a stranger's face looking back. In 12 hours, he would be back in his IDF uniform, briefing subordinates and reviewing after-action reports. But for the next 60 minutes, he would be a woman walking through the lobby of an apartment building where one of Israel's most wanted enemies lay sleeping. The irony was not lost on him. To reach his target, the future Prime Minister of Israel had become someone he was not. The three-car convoy moved through Beirut's late-night streets with careful adherence to traffic laws and speed limits. Nothing about their movement would attract attention from Lebanese police or the occasional PLO patrol. To any observer, they appeared to be what they purported to be, well-dressed residents returning home from evening social engagements. Team Alpha occupied the lead vehicle. Besides Barak in his feminine disguise, 5 Sayeret Matkal commandos sat in silence, their weapons concealed beneath winter coats despite the mild April weather. Each man carried enough firepower to neutralize multiple targets, but their mission required surgical precision. Abu Youssef would be eliminated with minimum collateral damage, maximum efficiency. In the second car, Team Bravo prepared for their own deadly appointment. Kamal Adwan's apartment building rose 6 stories above a quiet residential street in the Verdun district. Intelligence reports indicated he occupied the top floor with his wife and 2 young children, relying on a single bodyguard and the anonymity of his bourgeois lifestyle for protection. The building's entrance was secured by a night doorman who dozed intermittently at his desk, trusting in Beirut's reputation as a sanctuary for Palestinian leadership. The team leader studied photographs of their target one final time. Adwan, 41 years old, had been personally responsible for coordinating terrorist operations in the West Bank and Gaza. His fingerprints were on attacks that had killed dozens of Israeli civilians. But in a few minutes, the man in the photographs would be just another corpse in a city that had seen too many. Team Charlie faced the most complex tactical challenge. Kamal Nasser's ground floor apartment offered multiple escape routes but also multiple points of entry for his killers. As the PLO's chief spokesman, he had cultivated relationships with foreign journalists and diplomatic personnel who might complicate any operation in his vicinity. The team assigned to eliminate him would need to complete their mission without creating an international incident. The commandos checked their synchronized watches, 0125 hours. 5 minutes until simultaneous execution. Around the city, Shayetet 13 naval commandos had positioned themselves at key intersections and potential choke points. Lebanese police response times had been calculated based on months of observation. PLO reaction protocols had been analyzed and anticipated. Every variable that could be controlled had been controlled. What could not be controlled was the human element, the split-second decisions that would determine success or failure. Barak's vehicle stopped first, parking across the street from Abu Yusuf's building. The future prime minister stepped onto the sidewalk with the practiced grace of someone who belonged there, adjusting his purse and smoothing his dress. To the night doorman visible through the lobby's glass doors, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a respectable woman returning home after an evening out. The doorman barely glanced up as Barak approached the entrance. Lebanese society's traditional respect for women, combined with the late hour and the natural human tendency to see what one expected to see, worked in the Israelis' favor. The man behind the desk saw a conservatively dressed woman with keys in her hand and a perfectly reasonable explanation for her presence. 60 seconds later, Team Bravo's vehicle came to a stop outside Kamal Adwan's building. The commandos moved with fluid precision, their weapons still concealed but ready for instant deployment. Years of training had taught them to project calm normalcy while remaining prepared for explosive violence. They walked toward the building entrance like men who had every right to be there, their footsteps echoing softly on the pavement. Team Charlie took their positions as the second hand swept toward 0130. The synchronization was critical. If one team struck early, the sound of gunfire would alert the other targets. If they struck late, Lebanese security forces might have time to coordinate an effective response. The entire operation balanced on a knife's edge of timing that left no margin for error. In apartments across Beirut, 3 Palestinian leaders settled into their final moments of life without knowing it. Abu Yusuf may have been reviewing documents in his study. Kamal Adwan might have been checking on his sleeping children. Kamal Nasser could have been preparing for bed after another day of representing Palestinian aspirations to the international community. They had orchestrated the murder of innocents in Munich. Now murder was climbing the stairs to find them. The radio check came at exactly 0129, Alpha in position. Bravo in position. Charlie in position. Support teams confirmed their readiness to seal escape routes and intercept any interference. The elaborate choreography of violence was ready to begin. At 0130 hours, 3 doors would be breached simultaneously. The spring of youth would bloom in gunfire and blood, harvesting lives that had been marked for death since a September morning in Munich when the world watched Palestinian terrorists murder Israeli athletes. Time compressed into a single, crystalline moment of reckoning. The performance was about to begin. At precisely 1:30 a.m., 3 doors splintered inward across the Verdun district of Beirut, and the spring of youth bloomed in violence. Ehud Barak moved through Abu Yusuf's apartment building like a specter in a dress, the night doorman's body crumpled behind his desk where a silenced pistol had found its mark. The elevator carried him upward through 6 floors of sleeping families, none of whom would ever know how close death had passed their doors. His reflection in the polished metal showed a woman's face, but behind the carefully applied makeup, a killer's eyes counted off the seconds until synchronization. In apartments across the district, Palestinian leaders were living their final moments. The 6th-floor hallway stretched before Barak's team like a corridor in a nightmare. Apartment 3B lay at the end, its door bearing the nameplate that had appeared in so many intelligence photographs. Behind that door, Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, Abu Yusuf, architect of terror, Arafat's deputy, orchestrator of operations that had left Israeli children orphaned, slept beside his wife in the bed they had shared for 15 years. The door charge detonated with a muffled crack that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Barak's men poured through the smoking entrance with the fluid precision of machinery designed for killing. The apartment's interior layout matched the floor plans they had memorized during weeks of preparation: living room left, kitchen straight ahead, master bedroom to the right. Abu Yusuf died reaching for the pistol he kept in his nightstand drawer. The first burst of gunfire caught him as he lunged across his wife's sleeping form. The second burst ensured he would never orchestrate another attack against Israeli civilians. His wife, jolted awake by the explosion and gunfire, screamed once before catching a stray round that had been meant for her husband. She died clutching photographs of their children, her blood mixing with his on sheets that would never be washed clean. 6 blocks away, Team Bravo was painting similar scenes in different colors. Kamal Adwan's apartment building offered greater challenges, better security, multiple escape routes, and a target who had survived 30 years of Palestinian politics by trusting no one completely. But paranoia could not defeat the mathematics of violence when applied with Israeli precision. The team leader studied the building's entrance through night vision optics, counting guards, timing patrols, measuring the distance between potential cover positions. Adwan's bodyguard sat in the lobby reading a newspaper, a thermos of coffee and a half-finished card game spread on the table beside him. He looked up once as shadows moved past the windows, then returned to his reading. It was the last conscious act of his life. The suppressed gunfire that killed the bodyguard barely registered above the ambient noise of Beirut's sleeping streets. The commandos moved through the lobby like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by carpet that would soon be stained with blood. The elevator carried them upward to the 6th floor, where Kamal Adwan lay sleeping beside his pregnant wife, unaware that his coordination of West Bank operations had earned him a death sentence. The door to apartment 6A exploded inward at exactly 1:31 a.m. Adwan died fighting, his service pistol clearing its holster before Israeli bullets found their mark. He managed 3 shots that shattered mirrors and plaster but found no human targets. The return fire was more accurate, more final. The PLO operations chief collapsed beside his bed, his blood spreading across carpet his wife had chosen during happier days when the future seemed to promise something other than violence. On the ground floor of a building 12 blocks south, Team Charlie was completing the trinity of assassination. Kamal Nasser had always been the most visible of the 3 targets, his face familiar from television interviews and newspaper photographs where he articulated Palestinian grievances to Western audiences. As the PLO's chief spokesman, he had spent years crafting the narrative that portrayed his organization's terrorism as legitimate resistance. Now narrative was about to meet reality in the most final way possible. The team moved through his building with practiced efficiency, neutralizing security with the same cold precision their colleagues were applying across the city. Nasser's ground floor apartment offered multiple entrances and exits, a tactical advantage that became a liability when Israeli commandos used every access point simultaneously. The concussion of multiple door charges shattered the midnight quiet. Nasser died in his study, surrounded by the propaganda materials he had spent his career crafting. His typewriter, still loaded with paper bearing the letterhead of the Palestine Liberation Organization, would produce no more justifications for murder. His voice, which had explained away the Munich massacre as a legitimate expression of Palestinian frustration, was forever silenced by bullets fired with clinical accuracy. But precision is a fragile thing, and the night was not finished with its killing. The sound of gunfire echoed through apartment buildings where families had been sleeping peacefully minutes before. Doors opened as neighbors investigated the commotion, and innocence collided with violence in ways that no operational plan could anticipate or prevent. An Italian woman, visiting Beirut on business, opened her apartment door to investigate the explosions that had shaken her building. She found herself staring into the barrel of an Israeli assault rifle held by a commando, whose nerves were stretched taut by adrenaline and mission focus. The burst of gunfire that killed her was reflexive, instantaneous, irreversible. Across the city, Lebanese police were beginning to respond to reports of automatic weapons fire in residential neighborhoods. The first patrol car arrived at Abu Youssef's building as Barak's team was collecting intelligence materials from the dead man's apartment. Documents that detailed PLO operations, correspondence with international supporters, and plans for future attacks were stuffed into canvas bags with the same efficiency that had characterized the killing. Every piece of paper was potential intelligence, every intelligence breakthrough a potential life saved. The Lebanese officers who encountered the Israeli extraction team were young men serving in a police force that had learned to coexist with Palestinian armed presence in their city. They were not prepared for a firefight with elite commandos whose training exceeded anything in their experience. 2 policemen died in the lobby where the night doorman's body was already growing cold. The precision operation was becoming something messier, more human, more tragic. The commandos moved through smoke-filled corridors and blood-slicked floors, their mission accomplished but their extraction complicated by the chaos that violence always generates. Radio reports crackled with updates. Alpha complete, moving to extraction. Bravo complete, intelligence materials secured. Charlie complete, encountering civilian interference. By 1:50 a.m., 3 Palestinian leaders were dead, and the Israeli teams were racing through Beirut streets toward their rendezvous with the sea. The rental cars that had carried them to their targets now carried them away, Engines pushed to their limits as drivers navigated routes that had been memorized during months of preparation. Behind them, the Verdun district was awakening to sirens and shouting, to broken doors and shattered lives, to the reality that Israel's reach extended far beyond its official borders. The spring of youth had bloomed exactly as planned, but like all springs, it had brought growth and death in equal measure. The seeds of retribution, planted in Munich's Olympic Village, had finally borne their bitter fruit in the comfortable apartments of Beirut. 20 minutes after the first door had exploded, the hunters were returning to the sea, their work complete and their conscience clear. While the apartment buildings of Verdun echoed with gunfire and dying men's last breaths, the spring of youth bloomed across a wider field. The assassination of 3 PLO leaders was merely the most visible manifestation of an operation designed to cripple Palestinian infrastructure throughout Lebanon. As Ehud Barak's teams collected intelligence from blood-soaked apartments, other Israeli commandos were applying the same lethal precision to targets that would never make newspaper headlines. 25 miles south of Beirut, the ancient port city of Sidon slept under a canopy of Mediterranean stars, unaware that death was approaching its industrial district. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine had chosen their bomb-making facility with characteristic attention to operational security. Hidden within a nondescript warehouse complex near Sidon's fishing harbor, the factory produced the improvised explosive devices that PFLP cells smuggled across borders and detonated in Israeli shopping centers, bus stations, and schools. The scent of plastique and metal filings mingled with the salt air from the nearby sea, creating an atmosphere that spoke of patient craftsmanship applied to the art of murder. Lieutenant David Yishai led the secondary strike team through Sidon's narrow streets with the same methodical precision that characterized all aspects of Operation Spring of Youth. His men had studied architectural plans of the warehouse district for weeks, timing guard rotations and mapping escape routes with a thoroughness that separated elite soldiers from mere killers. They knew which buildings contained legitimate businesses and which served as fronts for Palestinian operations. They knew the difference between a night watchman earning honest wages and a terrorist sentry protecting instruments of death. The warehouse doors exploded inward at precisely 1:35 a.m., 5 minutes after the first shots were fired in Beirut. Inside, the commandos found a terrorist's dream and a civilized nation's nightmare: workbenches lined with bomb components, chemical mixing stations that could produce enough explosive to level city blocks, and completed devices ready for shipment to PFLP cells operating across the Middle East and Europe. Technical manuals in Arabic detailed the construction of increasingly sophisticated weapons. Shipping manifests revealed a distribution network that stretched from Damascus to Rome. The PFLP technicians working the night shift died at their workbenches, their expertise in creating death earning them the swift application of Israeli justice. The explosives they had crafted with such care were turned against their makers, the warehouse erupting in a fireball that illuminated Sidon's harbor like a premature dawn. The concussion shattered windows for blocks in every direction and sent a column of smoke into the night sky that could be seen from Lebanese naval patrols 20 miles offshore. Simultaneously, in Beirut's communications hub near the American University, other Israeli teams were severing the nerve connections that linked Palestinian operations across the region. The PLO's communications center occupied 3 floors of an office building that had once housed a thriving import-export business. From this location, Palestinian operatives coordinated with cells in Europe, maintained contact with training camps in Syria and Jordan, and received operational directives from Yasser Arafat's headquarters in Damascus. The radio equipment and telephone switching systems represented the nervous system of international terrorism. Staff Sergeant Rachel Shamir, one of the few women assigned to the operation, approached the building's entrance with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Her Hebrew accent had been polished away during months of training, replaced by the cultured Arabic of Beirut's educated classes. To the night security guard, she appeared to be exactly what her forged identification claimed: a communications technician responding to an emergency service call. The guard's throat was cut before he could reach for his telephone. Shamir's team moved through the building with surgical efficiency, planting explosive charges at key points while simultaneously downloading communications logs and operational files. The intelligence material they collected would provide Israeli analysts with months of insights into Palestinian operational methods and international connections. The building erupted at 1:42 a.m., its destruction precisely timed to coincide with similar operations across the city. Palestinian safe houses that had harbored international terrorists found themselves surrounded by Israeli commandos who knew their locations, their security procedures, and their occupants' identities. Years of Mossad surveillance had mapped every bolt hole, every weapons cache, every document archive that supported PLO operations in Lebanon. At a villa in the hills above Beirut, where European leftists came to receive training in urban guerrilla warfare, Israeli soldiers found classrooms equipped with scale models of Israeli cities, detailed maps of Jewish community centers in Europe, and instructional materials for constructing car bombs. The building's destruction sent another pillar of fire into the Lebanese night, visible from Palestinian camps where future terrorists were learning their deadly trade. In a basement archive near the Palestinian refugee camp of Ain al-Hilwa, the institutional memory of Palestinian terrorism was being systematically erased. The files stored in climate-controlled rooms beneath a medical clinic contained operational records dating back to the PLO's earliest campaigns against Israeli civilians. Photographs of successful attacks were filed alongside planning documents for future operations. Dossiers on European sympathizers and financial supporters revealed a network of collaboration that stretched from university campuses to government ministries. The Israeli team assigned to this target worked with the deliberate care of librarians, photographing key documents before destroying the originals. The intelligence value of this material was immense, but its destruction would cripple Palestinian operational planning for months to come. When the thermite charges ignited, they consumed not just paper and ink, but the accumulated knowledge that had made Palestinian terrorism increasingly sophisticated and deadly. By 2 a.m., as the primary assassination teams were racing toward their beach extraction point, the secondary operations had achieved their broader strategic objectives. The PFLP's bomb-making capability in southern Lebanon had been eliminated. Palestinian communications networks had been severed. Intelligence archives that documented decades of terrorist operations had been destroyed or captured. Safe houses that had harbored international fugitives lay in smoking ruins. The Spring of Youth had proved to be more than a surgical strike against 3 individual targets. It was a comprehensive assault on the infrastructure that enabled Palestinian terrorism to operate across international boundaries. Every demolished building, every destroyed communications center, every captured document represented a degradation of capabilities that would take years to rebuild. As Israeli commandos withdrew through the streets of Beirut and Sidon, they left behind a Palestinian movement that had been decapitated and blinded in a single night. The 3 dead leaders in their Verdun apartments would receive the headlines and the eulogies. But the real strategic victory lay in the systematic destruction of the operational networks that had made Palestinian terrorism a global threat. The hunters had not merely killed their prey, they had burned down the entire forest in which their enemies had learned to hide. The Mediterranean waves that would soon carry the Israeli strike force back to Haifa also carried the smoke from burning buildings where Palestinian dreams of destroying Israel had died in flames and gunfire. The spring had brought death to those who dealt in death, and the harvest was more complete than even its architects had dared to hope. Israel's message had been delivered with characteristic precision: those who murder innocents will find no sanctuary, no matter how far they run or how deeply they hide. The sirens began wailing across Beirut at 1:47 a.m., their urgent voices piercing the Mediterranean night like the cries of wounded animals. From police stations throughout the city, patrol cars raced toward the Verdun district, their drivers responding to fragmented radio reports of explosions, automatic weapons fire, and foreign commandos operating in the heart of Lebanon's capital. But the men they sought were already ghosts, moving through predetermined escape routes with the fluid precision of Mercury finding the shortest path to the sea. Ehud Barak stripped away his feminine disguise as the rental Peugeot raced through streets that seemed to pulse with approaching danger. The wig and makeup that had carried him past Abu Youssef's doorman now lay crumpled on the car floor, transformed from operational necessity into discarded theater props. His reflection in the side mirror showed the face that would appear in tomorrow's intelligence briefings, the commander who had led Israel's most audacious foreign operation since the rescue at Entebbe would not happen for 3 more years. Behind them, the Verdun district was awakening to a nightmare that would reshape Middle Eastern politics. Lebanese police cordoned off apartment buildings where broken doors revealed scenes of carnage that belonged in war zones, not residential neighborhoods. Officers trained for traffic violations and petty crime found themselves processing assassination sites that spoke of military precision and political calculation. The bodies of Abu Youssef and his wife lay beneath blood-soaked sheets while investigators tried to comprehend how Israeli commandos had penetrated the heart of Beirut, eliminated their targets, and vanished into the darkness. Radio traffic crackled with confusion and growing alarm, multiple casualties at 3 separate locations. Request military backup in Verdun district. Foreign infiltration confirmed, armed and extremely dangerous. The Lebanese security apparatus, caught completely off guard, struggled to coordinate a response to an operation that was already moving toward its conclusion. Team Alpha's extraction vehicle approached the first checkpoint at exactly 2:03 a.m. The young Lebanese policeman who flagged them down had been called from his normal patrol to assist with the emergency response. He approached the Peugeot with the casual authority of someone accustomed to checking identification and moving traffic along. His hand rested on his service pistol, but more from habit than genuine suspicion. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The suppressed gunfire that killed him barely registered above the sound of the car's engine. Barak's team accelerated through the checkpoint, leaving behind a body that would become another piece of evidence in the investigation that would consume Lebanese intelligence services for months to come. The mathematics of escape were unforgiving. Any delay, any unnecessary engagement, could trap them between the sea and Lebanese forces that were beginning to mobilize across the city. 6 blocks to the south, Team Bravo was encountering more determined resistance. A Lebanese army patrol, responding to reports of explosions in the warehouse district, had established a roadblock that covered the most direct route to the extraction point. Unlike the police checkpoint, this position was manned by soldiers who had seen combat during Lebanon's civil conflicts. Their weapons were loaded, their positions prepared, and their orders clear: stop any suspicious vehicles attempting to leave the affected areas. The firefight lasted 37 seconds and left 4 Lebanese soldiers dead. Israeli commandos, their night vision equipment providing decisive advantage in the darkness, engaged targets with the systematic efficiency that characterized every aspect of their training. Muzzle flashes strobed through the night like deadly lightning, and the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire echoed off apartment buildings where families cowered behind locked doors. Team Charlie faced the most complex extraction challenge. Their target building was located in a neighborhood that housed several diplomatic residences, including the apartments of foreign journalists who might complicate any engagement with Lebanese security forces. The team's route to the beach led directly past the Italian consulate, where the cultural attaché was hosting a late-night reception for visiting academics. The sound of their gunfight with Kamal Nasser's bodyguards had already attracted attention from party guests who stepped onto balconies to investigate the disturbance. The sight of armed men in combat gear running through streets normally associated with diplomatic receptions would fuel conspiracy theories and international incidents for years to come. But the sea was calling, and the tide was turning in Israel's favor. Mossad agents waited at 3 separate beach locations, their engines running and their eyes scanning the approaches for any sign of Lebanese pursuit. These were the same operatives who had spent months establishing their cover identities, renting safe houses, and mapping escape routes. Their patient preparation was now being tested in the crucible of real-time operations where a single mistake could mean capture, torture, and death. The first extraction team reached Ramlet al-Beta beach at 2:12 a.m., their headlights cutting through darkness that seemed pregnant with danger. The commandos rolled from their vehicles and waded into surf that lapped gently against sand, their weapons held high above the Mediterranean swells. Behind them, the lights of Beirut stretched along the coastline like a jeweled necklace, beautiful and deceptive in the distance. The Zodiac boats materialized from the darkness like prehistoric sea creatures rising from the depths. Shayetet 13 naval commandos had brought their inflatable craft within 100 meters of the shore, engines muffled and navigation lights extinguished. The pickup operation proceeded with the same choreographed precision that had characterized every aspect of the mission. Commandos waded into the surf, were hauled aboard rubber boats, and disappeared into the darkness before Lebanese coastal patrols could respond to reports of unusual activity. The second and third extraction points witnessed similar scenes played out in compressed time frames that allowed no margin for error. Radio communication between teams was limited to essential updates: Alpha extracted. Bravo extracted. Charlie extracted. Each confirmation meant another step closer to Israeli territorial waters and the safety that lay beyond Lebanon's reach. By 2:27 a.m., 73 Israeli commandos were racing across dark water toward their motherships. 2 soldiers had been left behind, not by choice, but by the unforgiving mathematics of combat casualties and Lebanese resistance that had proved more determined than intelligence estimates suggested. Their bodies would be recovered by Lebanese authorities, photographed for intelligence files, and eventually returned to Israel through diplomatic channels that neither government would officially acknowledge. The missile boats that had carried the strike force north from Haifa now received their human cargo with the efficiency of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. Wounded commandos were treated by naval medical personnel. Intelligence materials collected from Palestinian apartments were secured in waterproof containers. Weapons were cleaned and stowed according to regulations that governed even the most clandestine operations. Lieutenant Colonel Ehud Barak stood on the bridge of the lead vessel as Lebanese territorial waters fell behind them. The lights of Beirut receded into the distance, carrying with them the echoes of gunfire and the memory of 3 Palestinian leaders who would orchestrate no more attacks against Israeli civilians. The spring of 1973 had brought death to those who dealt in death, and the harvest had been more complete than even its architects had dared to hope. Radio silence would be maintained until they reached Israeli waters, but the commander of Sayeret Matkal allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The mission that had been conceived in the aftermath of Munich's horror had been executed with the precision that characterized Israel's evolution from victim to avenger. The boys had been sent forth, and they were coming home. Behind them, smoke still rose from burning buildings where Palestinian dreams of destroying Israel had died in flames and gunfire. The spring of youth was ending as it had begun, in darkness, in violence, and in the ancient calculus of retribution that governed relations between peoples who had learned to kill before they learned to forgive. The Mediterranean carried Israeli boats toward safety and Palestinian bodies toward graves, indifferent to the political calculations that had written these particular names in blood. By dawn, the hunters would be home, their work complete and their conscience clear. Dawn broke over Haifa harbor with the pale clarity that follows violent storms. The 8 Israeli missile boats slipped into their berths with no fanfare, no crowds, no official acknowledgement that they had spent the night rewriting the rules of Middle Eastern warfare. Dock workers who had learned to ask no questions about unusual naval movements went about their routine tasks, but the salt air carried something different, the metallic scent of completed vengeance and the ozone crackle of geopolitical transformation. Lieutenant Colonel Ehud Barak stepped onto Israeli soil at precisely 0647 hours, his boots touching concrete that marked the boundary between operational success and strategic consequence. Behind him, 73 commandos filed off their vessels with the quiet satisfaction of professionals who had executed a complex mission without losing a single man. Their weapons were clean, their equipment accounted for, their objectives achieved with the mathematical precision that had characterized every aspect of Operation Spring of Youth. In the space of 30 minutes, Israel had demonstrated that Palestinian terrorism's most protected leaders were, in fact, utterly vulnerable. The initial damage assessment read like a terrorist's obituary written in clinical military language. Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, Abu Youssef, Fatah's operations chief and Arafat's deputy, dead in his bedroom. Kamal Adwan, coordinator of West Bank operations and architect of countless attacks against Israeli civilians, dead in his apartment. Kamal Nasser, the PLO's eloquent spokesman who had spent years justifying murder as legitimate resistance, dead among his propaganda materials. But numbers told only part of the story. The 3 corpses cooling in Beirut morgues represented more than individual eliminations, they embodied the institutional memory, operational expertise, and strategic vision that had made Palestinian terrorism increasingly sophisticated and deadly. Their deaths created a leadership vacuum that would take years to fill, if it could be filled at all. The intelligence windfall exceeded even Mossad's most optimistic projections. Canvas bags filled with documents, photographs, communication logs, and operational plans had been extracted from Palestinian apartments and safe houses with the same efficiency that characterized the killing. In sterile analysis rooms beneath IDF headquarters, intelligence officers worked through material that provided unprecedented insights into Palestinian operational methods, international support networks, and planned future attacks. Financial records revealed the flow of money from sympathetic governments and private donors throughout the Arab world and Europe. Training manuals detailed the techniques being taught at camps in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Correspondence with European leftist groups exposed a support network that stretched from university campuses to government ministries. Most critically, operational plans outlined attacks against Israeli targets that were scheduled to occur within weeks. Major Sarah Goldstein, chief analyst for Palestinian affairs, summarized the intelligence coup in language that barely concealed her professional excitement. "We've just gained access to 5 years of Palestinian planning in a single night. This material will save Israeli lives for months to come." But the broader strategic implications were even more significant. Operation Spring of Youth had accomplished something that years of conventional military operations had failed to achieve. It had demonstrated that Palestinian leaders who orchestrated terrorism from comfortable exile were not beyond Israel's reach. The psychological impact on surviving PLO officials was immediate and profound. If Beirut, their supposed sanctuary, protected by Lebanese sovereignty and international law, could not guarantee their safety, then nowhere could. Within hours of the first news reports, Palestinian leaders throughout the Middle East were reassessing their security arrangements, changing their routines, and reconsidering the personal costs of their political commitments. The comfortable certainty that had allowed them to plan attacks against Israeli civilians while dining in French restaurants and sleeping in luxury apartments had been shattered by the sound of exploding doors and the sight of Israeli commandos materializing from the darkness. In Damascus, Yasser Arafat received the news with the stoic acceptance of a man who had always known this day would come. The PLO chairman had built his organization on the principle that revolutionary violence could force political concessions from stronger adversaries. Now he faced the reality that his enemies possessed the same capacity for violence, applied with far greater precision and strategic insight. The photographs of his dead lieutenants, transmitted through intelligence channels that carried no official acknowledgement, served as a reminder that leadership in the Palestinian movement had become a potentially fatal occupation. "They can kill us," Arafat told his remaining advisors in a Damascus safe house that no longer felt particularly safe, "but they cannot kill our cause." The words carried more hope than certainty, more defiance than confidence. The cause might survive, but the men who had given it operational coherence and strategic direction were already being prepared for burial in Lebanese soil. The international reaction varied according to the political calculations of governments that had learned to navigate Middle Eastern violence with careful ambiguity. European capitals that had provided diplomatic recognition and financial support to Palestinian organizations issued carefully worded statements condemning violations of Lebanese sovereignty while avoiding any specific mention of the dead terrorists or their activities. American officials, publicly committed to supporting legitimate Palestinian aspirations, privately expressed satisfaction that some of the world's most wanted terrorists had been eliminated without American fingerprints on the operation. Lebanese government officials, caught between their Palestinian guests and their desire to avoid becoming a battlefield for other people's wars, issued increasingly desperate calls for international intervention while quietly assessing whether they possessed the military capability to prevent future Israeli operations. The answer, uncomfortable in its clarity, was that they did not. Most significantly, the operation established a new paradigm for counterterrorism that would influence global security policies for decades to come. The precision with which Israeli forces had identified, located, and eliminated specific terrorist leaders while minimizing collateral damage demonstrated that targeted assassination could be conducted as a viable alternative to conventional military responses. Intelligence services throughout the Western world took careful note of the operational methods, the international coordination, and the strategic results achieved in a single night of carefully planned violence. The Spring of Youth had bloomed exactly as its architects intended, harvesting the lives of men who had sown death among innocents and demonstrating that terrorism's practitioners were not immune from the violence they inflicted on others. In the balance sheets where nations calculated the costs and benefits of their strategic choices, the operation registered as an unqualified success. But success in the Middle East is always temporary, and every action generates reactions that reshape the strategic landscape in unexpected ways. As Israeli commandos cleaned their weapons and filed their after-action reports, Palestinian survivors were already planning their response. The cycle of violence that had begun with Munich would continue through different channels, against different targets, with different methods. The rules had changed, but the game continued. The spring of 1973 had brought death to those who dealt in death, but it had also guaranteed that death would return in forms not yet imagined by either side. In the ancient calculus of Middle Eastern politics, every victory contained the seeds of future conflict, every tactical success generated strategic complications that would challenge policymakers for generations. The boys had been sent forth, and they had returned victorious. But their victory, like all victories in that troubled region, was merely the end of one chapter in a story that had no final page. The photograph that would define the aftermath of Operation Spring of Youth was taken from a helicopter circling above Beirut on the morning of April 12, 1973. Below, a river of humanity flowed through the city's streets, 250,000 mourners, 1/10 of Lebanon's entire population, moving in a tide of grief and rage toward the cemetery where 3 Palestinian leaders would be buried. From the air, the crowd appeared as a dark mass pulsing through Beirut's arteries like blood through a wounded heart. Never had an assassination operation generated such a massive demonstration of the cause it was intended to weaken. In the Palestinian refugee camps that dotted Lebanon's landscape, women ululated their grief while men cleaned weapons that had not seen use since the last round of Lebanese civil conflict. Children who had been born in exile carried photographs of the dead leaders as if they were martyred saints, their young faces reflecting a hatred that would outlive the generation that had taught it to them. The Spring of Youth had harvested 3 lives, but it had planted seeds of vengeance in 250,000 hearts. Yasser Arafat stood beside the freshly dug graves, his checkered keffiyeh whipping in the Mediterranean wind, and delivered a eulogy that transformed military defeat into political victory. "They can kill our leaders," he declared to the crowd that stretched beyond the horizon, "but every bullet they fire creates 10 new fighters for Palestine." The mathematics of martyrdom had always favored those who could afford to lose more than they gained, and the Palestinians had spent decades perfecting that particular calculus. But beneath the public displays of defiance, the operational reality was far more sobering. In safe houses throughout Damascus, Amman, and Baghdad, surviving PLO officials conducted desperate inventory of their shattered command structure. Abu Youssef had been irreplaceable, a strategic thinker who understood both military tactics and political calculation. Kamal Adwan's network of operatives in the West Bank and Gaza had been decapitated, leaving cells without coordination or guidance. Kamal Nasser's propaganda apparatus, built over decades of careful cultivation, would require years to rebuild. The organizational chart that had defined Palestinian terrorism's hierarchy was being redrawn with the urgency of wartime necessity. Younger men, less experienced but equally committed, stepped into roles for which they lacked both training and institutional memory. The smooth coordination that had characterized PLO operations was replaced by the improvisation that marked organizations under existential stress. In Beirut's government buildings, Lebanese officials confronted a crisis that exposed their nation's fundamental weakness. President Souleymane Franhay faced the impossible mathematics of Middle Eastern politics, how to maintain sovereignty over territory that more powerful neighbors treated as their private battlefield. The Israeli operation had demonstrated with surgical precision that Lebanese authority extended only as far as Lebanese military capability, and everyone understood the limitations of that particular equation. Foreign Minister Fouad Boutros found himself fielding angry calls from Arab capitals that demanded Lebanese action against Israeli aggression while simultaneously hosting Palestinian leaders who treated Lebanese sovereignty as a convenient fiction. "We are caught between the hammer and the anvil," he confided to his British counterpart during a diplomatic reception that carried all the gaiety of a funeral. "And both sides expect us to choose which one will crush us." The international community watched with the fascination of observers witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare. In the Pentagon's sterile briefing rooms, American military analysts studied operational reports that detailed the most successful targeted assassination campaign in modern history. The precision with which Israeli forces had identified, located, and eliminated specific terrorist leaders while minimizing collateral damage represented a quantum leap in counterterrorism capabilities. CIA Director William Colby summarized the strategic implications in language that would influence American policy for decades. "The Israelis have demonstrated that terrorism's practitioners are not immune from the violence they inflict on others. This changes everything about how we think about asymmetric warfare. European intelligence services, many of which maintained complex relationships with Palestinian organizations, faced the uncomfortable reality that their former partners were now proven targets for elimination. The comfortable assumption that terrorist leaders could operate from European capitals with impunity had been shattered by the sound of Israeli gunfire in Beirut's apartment buildings. But the most profound impact was psychological, operating in the realm of perception and deterrence where wars are ultimately won or lost. Palestinian leaders throughout the Middle East found themselves living in a universe where comfortable certainties had been replaced by mortal vulnerability. The safe houses that had once provided sanctuary now felt like potential tomb sites. The routines that had structured their daily lives became deadly patterns that Israeli intelligence might exploit. The distance between operational planning and personal consequence had collapsed to zero. Ahmed Jibril, leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, exemplified the new reality when he moved his headquarters for the fourth time in 6 months. "They have turned us all into hunted animals," he told his subordinates during a briefing conducted in a Damascus basement. "We must learn to think like prey if we wish to survive as predators." The operational restructuring forced upon Palestinian organizations would reshape international terrorism for years to come. Command hierarchies that had relied on personal relationships and institutional memory were replaced by cellular structures designed to limit the damage from future decapitation strikes. Communication methods that had depended on regular contact between senior leaders gave way to compartmentalized systems that sacrificed efficiency for security. Most significantly, the elimination of Palestinian leaders who had maintained some degree of operational restraint opened space for more radical elements who felt no obligation to limit their targeting or methods. The Spring of Youth had achieved its immediate tactical objectives, but it had also removed voices that might have counseled moderation in future Palestinian operations. The precedent established by Operation Spring of Youth would echo through decades of international conflict. From Belfast to Bogotá, from Ankara to Algiers, intelligence services began developing their own capabilities for targeted elimination of terrorist leaders. The Israeli model, extensive surveillance, precise planning, coordinated execution, became the template for counterterrorism operations that would span continents and decades. The comfortable fiction that terrorist leaders could orchestrate violence from distant sanctuaries while remaining personally immune from retaliation had been permanently shattered. The rules of engagement between states and non-state actors had been rewritten in blood and gunpowder on the streets of Beirut. But like all military victories, the Spring of Youth contained within it the seeds of future conflict. Each Palestinian leader eliminated would be replaced by someone younger, more radical, and more committed to matching Israeli escalation with Palestinian innovation. The cycle of violence that had begun with Munich would continue through different channels, against different targets, with methods that would make the original Olympic massacre seem almost restrained by comparison. As the last mourners filed away from the cemetery where 3 Palestinian leaders lay buried, and as Israeli commandos returned to their bases to prepare for missions not yet imagined, the Middle East continued its ancient dance of action and reaction, vengeance and counter-vengeance, victory and defeat measured in increments too small to notice but too significant to ignore. The spring of 1973 had brought death to those who dealt in death, but it had also guaranteed that death would return in forms not yet dreamed of by either side. 3 years after Israeli commandos vanished into the Mediterranean darkness off Beirut, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu crouched in the cargo hold of a C-130 Hercules transport plane flying through African night toward Uganda's Entebbe airport. Around him, 100 elite soldiers checked their weapons with the methodical precision that had become the signature of Israeli special operations. The mission they were about to execute, the rescue of 106 hostages from Palestinian and German terrorists, would captivate the world and establish Israel's reputation as the master of long-range precision strikes. But for Netanyahu and the other veterans of Operation Spring of Youth aboard that aircraft, Entebbe represented evolution, not revolution. The tactical principles, operational planning methods, and strategic audacity that would make Entebbe legendary had been perfected 3 years earlier in the apartment buildings of Beirut's Verdun district. The seeds planted in the Spring of Youth were bearing fruit across continents and decades. The helicopter assault on Entebbe's terminal building employed the same simultaneous multi-axis approach that had characterized the Beirut assassinations. The intelligence preparation that identified every terrorist, every hostage, And every potential obstacle reflected the systematic thoroughness first demonstrated in the months of surveillance that preceded the Palestinian leadership strikes. Most critically, the willingness to project military power across international boundaries to achieve objectives that conventional diplomacy could not accomplish had been established as Israeli doctrine during those 20 violent minutes in April 1973. Ehud Barak, now a brigadier general and architect of Israel's evolving special operations doctrine, watched the Entebbe rescue unfold from IDF headquarters with the satisfaction of a teacher seeing his methods validated on a global stage. "We learned in Beirut that surprise, speed, and violence of action can overcome any tactical disadvantage," he explained to the staff officers studying the operation's success. Entebbe proved that those lessons apply regardless of distance, complexity, or international consequences. But the Spring of Youth's influence extended far beyond Israeli military doctrine. In the summer of 1975, barely 2 years after Palestinian leaders were buried in Beirut cemeteries, Lebanon erupted into civil war that would consume the country for 15 years and reshape the entire Middle Eastern strategic landscape. The proximate causes were numerous and complex: sectarian tensions, Palestinian armed presence, Cold War proxy competition. But the psychological catalyst could be traced directly to that April night when Israeli commandos demonstrated Lebanon's fundamental inability to control events within its own borders. The Christian militias that took up arms against Palestinian forces in 1975 had absorbed a crucial lesson from Operation Spring of Youth: military action could succeed where political negotiation had failed. If Israeli commandos could eliminate Palestinian leaders with impunity, then Lebanese Christians could eliminate Palestinian military presence with sufficient organization and external support. The tactical principles that had guided the Beirut assassinations, precise planning, coordinated execution, acceptance of international condemnation in exchange for operational success, became the template for sectarian warfare that would devastate Lebanon for a generation. The Palestinian response to their leadership's elimination had been equally transformative. The organizational restructuring forced upon the PLO by the Spring of Youth's decapitation strikes fundamentally altered the nature of Palestinian resistance. The centralized command structure that had allowed figures like Abu Youssef to exercise strategic restraint was replaced by cellular networks that prioritized security over coordination. Individual cells, operating with minimal oversight from surviving leadership, began planning operations that reflected local initiative rather than organizational strategy. The result was a proliferation of terrorist attacks that were more frequent, more innovative, and more indiscriminate than anything the original PLO leadership had contemplated. The Coastal Road Massacre of 1978, in which Palestinian terrorists killed 37 Israeli civilians, including 13 children, represented the kind of operation that Abu Youssef's generation might have rejected as strategically counterproductive. But Abu Youssef was 3 years dead, and his successors operated according to different calculations. European capitals that had provided sanctuary for Palestinian political operations found themselves hosting a more dangerous species of resistance. The 1975 seizure of OPEC oil ministers in Vienna, the 1976 hijacking of an Air France flight to Entebbe, and the 1977 assault on a Lufthansa aircraft were all executed by Palestinian-linked organizations that had learned from Beirut's lessons about operational security and international reach. If Israeli intelligence could track Palestinian leaders to their supposedly secure apartments, then Palestinian operatives could target Western civilians in their supposedly secure airports and hotels. The comfortable assumption that terrorism was a Middle Eastern problem that could be contained within Middle Eastern boundaries had been shattered by Israeli precision in Beirut. The response was Palestinian innovation in methods and targeting that brought the conflict to European soil with consequences that would influence international relations for decades. Intelligence services throughout the Western world began developing their own targeted elimination capabilities. The CIA's development of drone warfare decades later would employ many of the same principles demonstrated in the Spring of Youth: extensive surveillance to identify high-value targets, precise application of lethal force to eliminate specific individuals, and acceptance of international legal complications in exchange for operational effectiveness. The British SAS operations in Northern Ireland, the German GSG-9 counterterrorism unit, and the French GIG all incorporated tactical innovations that could be traced back to those apartment buildings in Beirut. Most significantly, the psychological transformation of how democratic societies approached counterterrorism reflected lessons learned from Israeli success. The comfortable fiction that law enforcement methods could adequately address organized terrorism was replaced by military approaches that treated terrorist leaders as legitimate targets for elimination rather than criminals to be arrested and tried. But the most profound long-term impact was the normalization of targeted assassination as a tool of statecraft. The precision with which Israeli forces had eliminated Palestinian leaders while minimizing collateral damage established a new standard for what the international community would tolerate in the name of counterterrorism. The careful operational planning, the intelligence preparation, and the tactical execution had been so professional that even nations sympathetic to Palestinian aspirations found it difficult to condemn the methods employed. This precedent would echo through decades of international conflict. The American elimination of terrorist leaders in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Russian targeting of Chechen commanders, the Turkish operations against Kurdish militants, all employed variations of the tactical and strategic principles first demonstrated in Operation Spring of Youth. The apartment buildings of Beirut's Verdun district had become classrooms where the world learned new lessons about the intersection of precision, violence, and political will. By the dawn of the 21st century, targeted elimination had evolved from an Israeli innovation into a global norm. Unmanned aircraft carrying precision munitions replaced commandos with silenced pistols, but the fundamental strategic calculation remained unchanged. Specific individuals whose activities threatened state interests could be eliminated regardless of international boundaries or legal complications. The Spring of Youth had bloomed into a global transformation of how nations fought their enemies and protected their interests. The seeds scattered by those Israeli commandos as they withdrew through Beirut's streets had taken root in operational doctrines, legal frameworks, and strategic cultures across continents and decades. Yet like all military innovations, precision targeting generated adaptations that eventually challenged its effectiveness. The cellular structures adopted by terrorist organizations in response to leadership decapitation made them more resilient to targeted strikes but also more difficult to control or negotiate with. The proliferation of autonomous cells pursuing their own operational agendas created a security environment that was simultaneously more predictable in its methods and less manageable in its scope. The Middle East of the early 21st century, fractured by sectarian warfare, destabilized by failed states, and terrorized by organizations that owed their existence to the vacuum created by eliminated leadership, bore the genetic imprint of that April night in 1973 when Israeli commandos demonstrated that Palestinian leaders were not immune from the violence they inflicted on others. The spring had come and gone, but its consequences continued to bloom in forms that its architects could never have imagined. As the Mediterranean waves that had carried Israeli boats back to Haifa continued their eternal rhythm against Lebanese shores, they carried with them the echoes of gunfire that had reshaped the strategic landscape of international conflict. The boys had been sent forth, they had completed their mission, and they had returned to write reports that would influence policy for generations. But the true measure of their success could not be calculated in the bodies they left behind or the intelligence they collected. It lay in the transformation of how the world understood the relationship between precision, violence, and political will. The Spring of Youth had ended in a single night, but its harvest would continue for decades to come. In the ancient calculus of Middle Eastern politics, every action generates reactions that reshape history in ways both intended and unforeseen. The commandos who slipped through Beirut's darkness had set in motion forces that would outlive them all. 25 years after Israeli commandos vanished into the Mediterranean darkness off Beirut, Colonel Mark Boykin stood before a classified briefing at the Pentagon, addressing the architects of America's emerging Special Operations Doctrine. Behind him, projected on a screen marked Top Secret, were the tactical diagrams that had guided Operation Spring of Youth through its 20 minutes of perfect violence. The audience, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force operators, and CIA paramilitary specialists, studied those diagrams with the reverence that professionals reserve for masterpieces of their craft. "Gentlemen," Boykin began, his pointer tracing the route Israeli Zodiacs had followed from mother ships to Lebanese beaches, "you are looking at the DNA of modern special operations. Everything we do today, from Afghanistan to Somalia to the compounds where we hunt high-value targets, can be traced back to this single operation in 1973. The Spring of Youth had become the template from which all subsequent precision operations were constructed. The tactical innovations pioneered during that April night had evolved into doctrine that governed special operations forces across the democratic world. The seamless integration of naval insertion, urban warfare, and rapid extraction that characterized the Beirut mission was now standard curriculum at training facilities from Coronado to Hereford, from Quantico to Livorno. What had been revolutionary improvisation in 1973 had become fundamental methodology by the dawn of the 21st century. The multi-domain coordination that allowed Israeli missile boats to deliver commandos precisely to predetermined beach coordinates, support their urban operations through real-time intelligence updates, and extract them before enemy forces could respond effectively had established the gold standard for deep strike operations. Every subsequent mission that required projecting military power across international boundaries to achieve objectives beyond the reach of conventional forces bore the genetic imprint of those Israeli zodiacs cutting through Mediterranean swells. But the operation's most profound innovation lay in its fusion of intelligence gathering and military action. For decades, the worlds of espionage and special operations had existed in parallel universes, each governed by different methodologies, different risk calculations, and different definitions of success. Mossad operatives gathered intelligence while military units executed operations, and the coordination between them was often tenuous, incomplete, and occasionally catastrophic in its failures. Operation Spring of Youth had demonstrated a new paradigm. Intelligence and operations as a single, integrated system where surveillance teams and assault teams functioned as components of the same precision instrument. The months of patient observation that mapped Palestinian leaders' routines were not separate from the minutes of violent action that eliminated them, they were phases of the same extended operation, each optimized to support the other. This fusion became the foundation upon which modern counterterrorism was built. The CIA's Counterterrorism Center, established in the 1980s, employed organizational structures that reflected lessons learned from Israeli success in Beirut. Intelligence analysts and paramilitary operators worked in the same facilities, planned operations together, and shared accountability for results in ways that would have been unthinkable before the Spring of Youth demonstrated their potential synergy. The kill-capture missions that would define American special operations in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later represented direct descendants of the tactical principles first demonstrated in Palestinian apartments. The intelligence preparation that identified high-value targets, the precision strikes that eliminated them, and the immediate exploitation of captured materials all reflected methodologies pioneered by Israeli commandos who had learned to think of intelligence and operations as inseparable elements of the same strategic approach. European counterterrorism forces absorbed similar lessons through different channels. The British SAS operations in Northern Ireland, the German GSG-9 response to the Mogadishu hijacking, and the French Gigan assault on terrorists in Marseille all employed variations of the intelligence operations fusion first perfected in Beirut. The patient surveillance, the precise planning, the coordinated execution, and the immediate exploitation of results became standard operating procedures for elite units confronting terrorist threats across the Western world. Most significantly, the psychological transformation of how democratic societies approached terrorism reflected the Israeli demonstration that precision could be both tactically effective and strategically acceptable. The careful operational planning, the surgical execution, and the minimal collateral damage had established new standards for what international opinion would tolerate in the name of counterterrorism. The deep strike capability demonstrated by Operation Spring of Youth revolutionized strategic thinking about the projection of military power. Traditional military doctrine had assumed that complex operations requiring extensive coordination could only be conducted within secure operational environments where friendly forces controlled territory, airspace, and communications. The Israeli penetration of Beirut had shattered those assumptions, proving that small, elite units could operate effectively in hostile territory if their intelligence preparation was thorough enough and their execution precise enough. This principle would govern American special operations from the Iran hostage rescue attempt through the elimination of Osama bin Laden. The tactical challenges varied, but the fundamental strategic calculation remained constant. Small units with perfect intelligence could achieve objectives that large conventional forces could not accomplish without unacceptable political or military costs. The helicopter assault on bin Laden's compound in Pakistan employed the same multi-domain coordination that had characterized the Beirut operation: extensive intelligence preparation, precise timing, coordinated execution, and rapid extraction before enemy forces could respond. The tactical details had evolved with technology, but the operational framework remained unchanged from the principles first demonstrated by Israeli commandos 4 decades earlier. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Operation Spring of Youth was its demonstration that moral clarity could coexist with operational complexity. The Palestinian leaders eliminated in Beirut were not abstract strategic targets, they were specific individuals who had orchestrated the murder of innocent civilians. The intelligence preparation that identified them, the tactical planning that reached them, and the precision that eliminated them while minimizing collateral damage reflected a moral framework that distinguished between legitimate military targets and innocent bystanders. This distinction became fundamental to Western counterterrorism doctrine, establishing legal and ethical frameworks that governed the use of targeted force against non-state actors. The careful discrimination between combatants and civilians, the proportionality of response, and the strategic necessity of action all reflected principles first articulated through Israeli operations in 1973. The apartment buildings of Beirut's Verdun district had become laboratories where the future of warfare was invented. By the early 21st century, the tactical innovations pioneered during Operation Spring of Youth had evolved into technologies and doctrines that would have seemed like science fiction to the commandos who paddled silently through Mediterranean surf in 1973. Unmanned aircraft carrying precision munitions could eliminate high-value targets without risking friendly casualties. Satellite communications allowed real-time coordination between intelligence analysts and field operatives separated by continents. Night vision technology and precision-guided weapons had made darkness and distance tactical advantages rather than obstacles. But the fundamental strategic principles remained unchanged. Precise intelligence could identify specific threats, small elite units could eliminate those threats with surgical accuracy, and the psychological impact of successful operations could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military force could not accomplish. The boys who had been sent forth from Haifa harbor in April 1973 had returned with more than intelligence documents and confirmed kills. They had brought back the blueprints for a new form of warfare that balanced precision with power, discrimination with lethality, strategic necessity with moral constraint. Their 20 minutes of controlled violence in Beirut had established methodologies that would influence military operations across decades and continents. The Spring of Youth had ended with 3 Palestinian leaders dead and Israeli commandos safely extracted to their home base. But its true conclusion could be measured in the operations that followed: Entebbe and Mogadishu, the elimination of terrorist leaders from Afghanistan to Somalia, the evolution of special operations from tactical expedient to strategic doctrine. In the final accounting, Operation Spring of Youth had achieved something more significant than the elimination of 3 terrorist leaders. It had demonstrated that democratic societies possess the capability, the methodology, and the moral framework to defend themselves against enemies who recognize no boundaries of law, geography, or human decency. The precision that characterized every aspect of the operation, from intelligence gathering to tactical execution to strategic follow-through, had established new standards for how civilized nations could respond to barbarism without becoming barbaric themselves. The Mediterranean waves that had carried Israeli boats back to Haifa continued their eternal rhythm against Lebanese shores, indifferent to the human calculations that had briefly disturbed their peace. But the echoes of that disturbance continued to resonate through the corridors of power, the training facilities of elite units, and the operational planning centers where future operations were conceived and executed. The spring of 1973 had ended, but its harvest would continue for generations to come. In the architecture of modern warfare, Operation Spring of Youth occupied the same foundational position that classical orders held in traditional building, not merely successful in itself, but generative of principles that would support structures far grander than its original designers had imagined. The boys who slipped through darkness to settle accounts written in blood had established an inheritance that would outlive them all. The machinery of precision, once set in motion, continued to turn with the inexorable logic of historical necessity.